So in my last trip to the secondhand bookstore, well, not my last trip actually, in one of the videos I took you along to a secondhand bookstore, I said I was going to show you what I brought home. So this is one of them. I was waiting for the next movie to start. It was International Film Festival season at the time, and it was raining, and so we took shelter in a secondhand bookstore that's been around for ages. That's retail. I paid close to retail. That's $49. I don't know when that price is from though, but the secondhand bookstore price is $45, which I am more than happy to pay because I would like to support local bookstores, especially those who've been around for forever. A lot of bookstores have to close down because they cannot compete with Amazon. So the book is called The Cairo Trilogy by Naguib Mahfouz. Now I am kind of kicking myself for never really, I've never heard of him. And even among the more well-read of my friends, they, for some reason, I've never heard of this man either. And he is the Nobel laureate for literature in 1988. So 1988 is when a lot of my generation graduated from high school and started university, and of course a lot of them are English literature student, and the operative word being English. And Naguib Mahfouz is, or was, I think he passed away, Egyptian. And so this was written, I believe, in the late 50s, early 60s, and very much in an environment where a lot of the Asia Africa is the term that I grew up learning in high school. The Asian and African nations of the world just came out of colonialism, just came out of various power of the world imposing themselves over others, I suppose. Just you know, coming out of World War II, the end of World War II, a lot of social unrest, a lot of growing pains for nations and cultures, and it's a lot of, in a lot of cultures and a lot of nations and a lot of countries, it is their first foray into a new world. And so I've never heard of him. I just can't get over that, and I'm feeling a little bit, I don't know, ashamed of myself, I suppose. And part of me wonder as to whether the fact that he isn't more talked about, at least in my circle, I suppose, is because he's Egyptian and my circle is largely English speaking. But then you have the likes of Gabriel, Garcia, Marquez, whose work isn't in English, who isn't from an English-speaking country, and then the likes of Haruki Murakami, and the likes of Anita Desai and Arundhati Roy, who's South Asian. Well, some of the South Asian writers, Indian writers, a lot of them actually wrote in English because English is their first language. Although the English has a slightly different flavor. You can tell when you read them. A bit like a lot of my Singaporean friends and Malaysian friends, their English is their first language. Although they have an accent when they talk, and people always ask, what's your first language? And I remember a Singaporean friend of mine was quite irritated because she's tired of having to answer that question. And having people say, really, when she said that her first language is English, because she has a very strong Singaporean accent. So, I'm sorry guys, I have to cough quite a bit and pause because I have been sieged by this coughing fit again, which I thought I've escaped because usually it got me in August and now it's already going into October. I thought I escaped it, but I didn't. I haven't. So this is by Everyman's Library, and I will talk about Everyman's Library books in a separate video. One of my favorite books, one of my favorite edition of books publishers of all time. They are currently, I think, under the umbrella. They're owned by, it seems like every other publishing house is owned by Random House, but I think it's under Random House. I think they fall under Random House now. And one of the reasons why I like a lot of the Everyman's Library books is because of this timeline, and they always have great introduction. I will talk about Everyman's Library book in a separate video, and I also will read out the entire introduction of this book so that you can understand a little bit more about it, if you choose to, or if you feel like you want to. The person who wrote this introduction is, he is Sabri Haves, is Professor of Modern Arabic and Comparative Literature in the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. He has known Mahfouz since 1960 and published numerous articles and 2 books on him in Arabic. He has written extensively on modern Arabic literature and literary theory in both Arabic and English. His most recent book in English is The Genesis of Arabic Narrative Discourse, a study in the sociology of modern Arabic literature. This book is the first edition of Everyman's Library's The Cairo Trilogy, which is this particular 3 books in one here, which originally was intended to be one book, but for economical purposes, the publisher at the time decided to split the book into 3. So here they are published as one. So in closing, so this is, to show you the book that I got, which is this one here. And I will talk about Everyman's Library book in a separate video, as well as read out the entire introduction of this book in a separate video. But here I would like to close with reading out a few paragraphs that really stood out for me. Here it says here, novels were unknown in Arabic literature before the 20th century. This is rather ironic in a culture that produced one of the most fascinating and influential narrative texts, the Arabian Nights. But for centuries, this narrative gem, which is a potent art text in the work of contemporary writers such as Borges, Marquez, Rushdie, Barthes, and Eco, was relegated to the ranks of popular culture. That did not prevent it from firing the imagination of the young Mahfouz and inspiring him to become the new Sherazade of Arabic narrative. The 30 years between the birth of the Arabic novel and Mahfouz's first work can be seen retrospectively as preparing the ground for the arrival of the master par excellence of this genre in Arabic literature. And then there's a few here. Here it says, the title of this first realistic novel, Al-Kahira Al-Jadida, New Cairo, written in the first year of the war but not published until 1943, sums up his objective, his being Mahfouz, to articulate the new reality of a changing city. During the remaining years of World War II, he wrote 3 more novels, surveying the socio-historical reality of Egypt from the beginning of the 20th century up to the war. These novels are concerned with the transformation of Cairo, physical and cultural. The urban space of old and new Cairo is both the setting and the symbol of the clashes of cultural values which affect many of the inhabitants of this teeming third world metropolis. The novel of this phase of Mahfouz's literary career reflect the trauma of change and its social, human, and political consequences. They shift the focus of the Arabic novel from the country to the city, from the past to the present. They force it to deal with the problems of change and the conflict between the old and the new, between tradition and modernity. And then here it says, thus the trilogy was the result of his search for a sense of direction and of personal and national history. It is a multi-stranded narrative that records the socio-political transformation of modern Egypt in its quest for national identity and a role in the modern world. It also sketches the topography of the urban scene with its rich cultural heritage and elaborate network of human relations. It is a valuable document of social history, and a of cultural anthropology, as well as a literary masterpiece. It should be read both as a realistic representation of its society and as an allegorical rendering of Egypt's quest for nationhood and modernity because of its intricate viewing of the nation from multiple narrative and ideological positions. And then here, further down here, I was reading up here, further down here, it says the trilogy is the great family saga of modern Arabic literature and the work that enshrines middle-class morality and culture. It places the Egyptian family at the heart of its narrative and follows it up and down over 3 different generations. Unlike many European novels of its ilk, it does not take the adventure or education of the individual as its core, but gives the central role to the family and the collective. And then I'm going to further quote something here. It says here, it says, another indication of Amina is, I think, the matriarch in the trilogy. Another indication of Amina's importance is the narrative subversion of the established order. The allocation of space in the house is hierarchically designated. The patriarch occupies the top floor, the mother and the male children the middle floor, the other females the ground floor, and the baking room is banished to the courtyard. But the temporal arrangement of the narrative brings the baking room, the domain of the mother, and her domestic activities forward. This narrative inversion of the realistic order subverts reality and rebalances a social hierarchy that diminishes the status of women by giving them narrative precedence over the world of men. And I just think that books like this, and I'm going to have a series of, I don't know what to call it. I was going to say non-English speaking world books, but then we have, as I said, the likes of Gabriel, Garcia, Marquez, and Haruki Murakami, which are not at all obscure. They are widely known in today's English speaking world. But then there are, perhaps this is just my circle. Maybe I am sheltered from them. Maybe it's just me who isn't exposed to this. But as I probably mentioned, I talk to people who are more or less relatively well read, and they haven't heard of some of these authors, and some Indonesian authors I would like to talk about as well. Chinese, there are Indian authors, Japanese, and as I mentioned, I'm talking about Indian authors or South Asian authors Asian authors who do not write in the English language but write in their own native tongue. That is not to say that English is not the native tongue of a lot of South Asian writers, as I've mentioned, is the case with people in Southeast Asia as well. But so let me continue just really quickly here. In these examples concerning the daily rituals, the mundane and the quotidian, one glimpses certain aspects of the politics of narrative presentation, which Mahfouz employs in the trilogy Politics of Gender and Power. Simple rituals are depicted as repositories of cultural values and power relationships, as microcosm of political ones. We see how the life of the family is inseparable from the vicissitudes of the times and of politics in the country, and how spatial presentations shift to suit temporal changes. But nowhere in the trilogy are the realistic and the allegorical so closely intertwined as in the central love story of the novel, that of Kemal and Ida. And then at the end here, at the end of the introduction, it says the novel also has its prophetic vision and warning for the future. Every novel in the trilogy ends with a death and a birth, but the death and birth of the final novel, Sugar Street, are oracular. The novel ends with the death of Amina and the imprisonment of her 2 grandchildren, Ahmad and Abdul Munin, the communist and the Muslim brother, the two exponents of the conflicting ideologies of progress and regression, emerge from the same house on Sugar Street and are at the end incarcerated in the same cell. But the birth in this final novel is especially significant, for the newborn is the son of the Islamicists, a portent that is still relevant to the Arab reality of the present day. So that was written in 2001 when Everyman's Library first published these works from the late 50s and early 60s. So for a whole reading of the whole introduction and for a bit of chat, look out for a video on that, and for a chat about why I think Everyman's Library is one of the best editions of books in the world. Also, check out, stay tuned for my next post on that. I'll talk to you then.